So one of the things that, I'm sorry, it's me again, but this is the last you'll hear of me today. So one of the things that we wanted to spend a little bit of time going through, also to prepare you for the discussion that will be coming, but also just in general, clinical trial awareness is something that we felt is particularly important. I'll discuss this a little bit tomorrow when we talk about health disparities and some of the disparities in trials, but a little bit like when we did the 101 with Teresa, instead of just having Dr. Joe want like Charlie Brown's teacher, we're going to try and do it as a little bit of a back and forth. So I'll turn it over to the boss.
Give you the mic.
Sure.
And I'm going to stay here.
Sounds good.
That way I can actually have the clicker as well. So today we are going to talk about clinical trials, and we have three objectives. One is provide the rationale for clinical trials, right? The second one is be able to outline the phases of clinical trials and then discuss the risks and benefit of clinical trials. But before we go into that, I'm actually going to take us back and forth. One of the things that Dr. Joe, that you say and other experts say is that you should consider clinical trials as part of your care. What does that mean in English?
So what it means is that clinical trials aren't some kind of completely different phenomenon than what you're receiving on a regular basis for your care. We want to, if you will, normalize the concept of a clinical trial. Because sometimes people hear clinical trial, they think like, I guess I'm going to be some kind of experimental mouse that's going to be put into a maze somewhere, and I don't know if I'm going to get out, and it's going to have all this weirdness to it. You know, part of the reality is that the very place that the vast majority of people get their clinical trials is the very same place that they're getting their regular care, or if not, it's very similar to it. So I think in principle, yeah, like the concept is to say, part of clinical trials are part of the natural process of care, and we don't want it to be viewed very differently. That being said, we want people to view it differently enough to recognize that it plays a unique role in the way we care for patients, and it gives people an opportunity to have access to treatments that they would otherwise not have access to.
So for me as a patient, when I come to you and I say I may be progressing, or if I progress in the future, what clinical trials are available for me as part of my care should be one of the standard questions I should ask you.
Absolutely. So whenever we're looking at options of treatment, we almost always have a standard of care option, but we also may have a clinical trial, whether it's newly diagnosed, early relapsed, or have had 10 different treatments of myeloma before. That's where we tend to think of more clinical trials later on, where people have run out of other options. But don't think of clinical trials as only being the so-called Hail Mary pass when everything else has failed and you have no other choice. We want to think about it as choice all the way through, so that people can have an opportunity to participate even in earlier line therapy.
So earlier, a few minutes ago, you brought out this word guinea pig. So clinical trial is a word that is used to hide the fact that this is making patients guinea pigs, and it is dangerous, and we leave the patients broke, right?
No. So hopefully the answer to that is no. So the idea is never to make someone a guinea pig per se. Right? So we're going to be talking a bit more about drug development as we go through, but being very pragmatic. And I hope it's okay to use this word. I'm saying, I want you as a myeloma patient to be selfish, right? I want you to have what's best for you. Because sometimes people think, oh, if I'm going to go on to clinical trial, it's because I'm kind of donating my body to science, or I'm going to help other myeloma patients in the future. Well, it's not to say that there may not be some trickle-down effect to others, but it really should be about you. Is this something that would be valuable and beneficial to you by getting earlier access to treatment by getting something in addition to the standard of care to potentially getting something better than what's currently available. It's not that someone's giving you some kind of placebo. We would never do that in myeloma. We can't ethically. We have to, at minimum, give you what is the standard of care. And very often it's a question of adding something to what we would normally give. You know, we've learned that this combination works really well, kind of like I shared earlier, that that 3-drug combination of VRD, Velcade, Revlimid, dexamethasone, has been used for many years, has been very effective. Can we make it better by adding Darzalex or Sarclisa to it? And we learned, yes, we could. There's no way we would have learned that had we not done it in the context of a trial. So if someone goes on to a trial like that, they're at least getting the VRD, if not getting the VRD plus something else.
You mentioned earlier, over the last 20 years, close to 20 drugs have been approved for the treatment of multiple myeloma. Which one of those drugs haven't gone through a clinical trial?
None of them. They've all gone through clinical trials. So I see the sarcastic tone. I love it. But you know, that's exactly how drugs get developed. We'll talk through the drug development in a moment and how we get there. But every trial, every drug must have gone through clinical trials. We study things in the lab long before we bring them to patients. We study them in cell lines, as we call them. So I can have in my lab, we have like a culture of cells that mimic what real myeloma cells are like in the body. It's not a perfect example of what, you know, you can imagine that in a car research facility, right, they're testing out tires and they're putting them through all sorts of tests. The tire is not on the vehicle at the time. They're testing it in a test tube, as it were, or in a place to see if it has validity by itself, and then they'll test it on a car in a similar capacity. We've put these drugs through a lot of tests in the lab before we ever bring them to patients.
So what I'm hearing you say is clinical trial is part of the normal drug development cycle.
Absolutely. So that cycle, which we see a little bit outlined here, starts with, remember how I showed you that picture of the myeloma cell with Teresa and we saw all the different things sticking out of it? We want to learn. We can't develop a drug for something we don't understand that what we're attacking. So that's why so much research goes on in trying to understand and characterize what does this enemy myeloma look like? What does the cell look like? Where might the cell have its Achilles heel, right? Where can we attack the cell? Where can we get it? And so we identify these concepts or targets, as I've listed here in the lab. And then we want to see if we can actually prove that. We test, as I mentioned, in cell lines or in animal models, because believe it or not, you're a lot more like a mouse than you might think you are. We actually have a lot of similarities, genetically speaking. I know it's a little creepy, but it's true. Genetically speaking, we're quite close to them. And then once we've tested that, then we can now bring it into a larger patient population.
So those are the preclinical trial, the clinical trial, and then the drug development portion, right? What are the various phases of clinical trials?
Right, so when we talk about the phases of clinical trial, we classically talk about phase 1, 2, and 3, and to some degree 4. But even before phase 1, we do have some things that we have to do. And as I've mentioned, this is where we test in the lab, where we work on it in animal models or in cell lines, where we want to see, is there any evidence that this compound, this drug, is actually gonna damage myeloma cells and prevent their growth. And then we bring that very first phase 1 clinical trial, we call a first in human trial. In the clinic that I have in Arizona, this is what we focus in on. I've had the privilege of doing several of these first in human trials where we've tried a new drug that has never been used before. But when we come to phase 1, the concept here is a little different. This is what's important. This is where sometimes I think people have thought, oh, am I just a guinea pig? First of all, you're clearly not a guinea pig. But the concept of a phase 1 trial is the very first time we bring it into humans. If there are 3 words I say repeatedly in my clinic when the students and residents work with me, is safety is paramount. So the FDA guides this. It's under very careful protection. Safety is the most important thing. We want to make sure we're not overdosing people. So we typically have to start very low dose. So it could mean that if someone's going on to a phase 1 trial, they're going to get a very low dose of the drug. A lot of our trials allow that same patient to get a higher dose, assuming they tolerate the first dose well. So the focus of phase 1 is not so much, is the drug working to kill myeloma cells, as is the drug safe? And at what dose should I be giving this drug? So if we think a drug is going to work at 10 milligrams, just to keep it really simple, we might say the very first patient we treat with this drug, we're going to give them 1 milligram, sometimes even 0.1 milligrams, because that estimate for 10 may be way off. And I've developed drugs where we thought it was going to be 10 milligrams. It turned out to be less than 1 was the right dose. So we start low, and then we move up relatively quickly over a few patients to get to the dose that we think is going to be effective. And we want to make sure that we characterize that it's safe. That's the essence of a phase 1 trial, which leads us to a phase 2 trial where we say, okay, you know what? 10 milligrams seems to be the go-to dose. But now we've only treated half a dozen people with it. Now let's do a trial of, let's say, 60 patients who get that 10 milligrams. Now we're focusing on how effective is the drug. And some trials will have a system where we don't put all 60 patients on right away, right? We put on several at a time. And if out of the first 15 we don't see responses, we may have to abandon the study. On the other hand, if we see lots of responses early on, we may increase the numbers to even further confirm the fact that the drug is working well. And that becomes the phase 2 trial. Most phase 2 trials are what we call a single arm. You're not comparing one treatment strategy to another. You're just introducing this new treatment. But ultimately, the mother of all trials, as it were, is the phase 3 trial. And that's where you say, look, this drug is working so well at that 10 milligrams, so many people are responding to it. Now I'm going to compare it to the standard of care. So is the standard of care this other drug? So let's see, we do this other drug versus this other drug plus this new one versus just the old one to see, is this new drug adding to it? There are different ways that we can design trials, but as long as the people in the so-called control arm, the arm of the standard of care, are getting clearly the standard of care, and then the patients in the intervention arm are getting the standard of care plus something new. That's typically how we do a phase 3 trial. And these ones are much, much larger. These are typically hundreds of patients that need to be on this trial, and this is the trial that ultimately leads typically to approval of drugs.
But there are also, drugs can be approved with the result of phase 2 clinical trials in an accelerated mode.
Correct. So I mentioned this briefly when we talked about belantamab earlier, that there is this accelerated approval. And, you know, Danielle beautifully described the importance of advocacy and so on. This has been advocacy in the cancer community for many years, of saying, if we only wait to get a drug approved after it has completed a phase 3 trial. Let me give you a sense. I helped develop the drug that we now use, Sarclisa. Led the first in human clinical trial. And that was over, let me see, that would have been 13 years ago where we did that first in human study. And it was only a couple years ago that we really completed the large phase 3 trial. So we would have had to make patients wait 12 years, essentially, to get access to this drug. So the FDA has said, okay, in that early phase 2 trial, after you've worked out the phase 1, you worked out the dosing, in that first trial that you did of 60, 80, 100 patients, if there's enough of a signal that the drug is working, we will give it approval, sort of, if you will, a conditional kind of approval, saying we'll approve it, but you need to go on and do the phase 3 trial. But patients in that interim get access to the drug. And that's what becomes really important. I mean, maybe the most important lesson, if you're, you know, busy on Instagram right now or doing whatever else, you're not really listening to me, which is fine. But if there's one thing I really want you to listen to is the fact that the key of clinical trials for the patient is to give you access to something earlier than when it's fully approved. It's not just about helping others. That's a noble and lovely thing to consider, but getting that access early on. And very often getting that access early on saves lives. Because by the time that phase 3 trial is done, that patient may not be with us anymore, who would have had access to it. So that's the key of being able to get accelerated approval.
So Dr. Joe, before I ask you to summarize the 3 phases of clinical trials, you mentioned during phase 1, one of the goals of phase 1 is to be able to find out what is the maximum tolerated dose of a drug, right? Earlier, when you were having a conversation with Teresa, you mentioned about the side effects of steroids. Use steroids the 4 days on, 4 days off versus the current practice, and talk about what is the difference between the maximum tolerated dose and the minimum effective.
Yeah, the phase 1 community outside of myeloma, even just in cancer, is questioning this old adage that I shared earlier, that more is better, right? That you just want to give as much drug as the patient can handle because it's going to hit more cancer cells. That's what we call the MTD, or the maximum tolerated dose. So in that phase 1 trial, as I said, we tested at 0.1, we tested at 1, we tested at 5, we tested at 10. 10 is the maximum tolerated dose, because we learned that at 10 people, maybe we even went higher to 15 and found, oh my goodness, at 15 there was a lot of side effects, so we come back down and keep it at 10. But just because 10 was the maximum they needed, maybe they don't need all the time. Maybe 5 was actually enough. And this is the kind of work that we're trying to do now. And sadly, sometimes we end up figuring it out later, right? As I commented earlier, almost every drug in myeloma now, we give it a lower dose than the way it was first approved. Because it was built on that maximum tolerated dose. And the reason why we focus on this so much, one, is not just to affect the way we develop drugs, but also to reassure you, because I've had patients say to me, I heard, doctor, that the clinical trial used 25 milligrams of Revlimid, but my doctor gave me 5. Why is she only giving me 1/5 of the dose, all right? These drugs don't work in that simple way of thinking that 5 is 1/5 of 25. It's not that simple. It's the way the drugs interact with us. And so we're learning now that often we can use lower doses of drugs, and this becomes particularly important when we start combining drugs together, because maybe you need just a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Now, sometimes people take it to an extreme and they're like, here, just smell these 6 bottles and then leave, right? Like, we're not necessarily giving homeopathic doses of these drugs, but we are trying to find the minimally effective dose, meaning what's the lowest amount that I can take but still have benefit?
So I don't know if it is intentional or unintentional. He avoided my question about steroids. So when I was treated for myeloma in 1995, I took 40 milligrams of Dex every day for 4 days, took a 4-day break, and came back on 40 milligrams of Dex for another 4 days. I basically lived next to the refrigerator, and I was a little bigger than I am right now. But over time, there was a clinical trial that was initiated as input by a patient, Mike Katz, who some of you may know, who was a board member with the International Myeloma Foundation, and he challenged one of the physicians and asked, you guys talk about creating clinical trials for new drugs, but how about for steroids? And they actually tested, and I'll let you speak about the output.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. One, because I just loved Mike Katz, incredible, and now Jason, his son, sits on our board. But it was one of the earliest examples of patient engagement and patient involvement in research, where we have a group of institutions that work together to do clinical trials called ECOG, the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group, and now Yellock sits in that position. And the patient, Mike Katz at the time, said, look, can't you guys do a trial that involves us getting less dexamethasone? If you didn't fully catch what Yellock said, you might think 40 milligrams of dexamethasone every week is a lot. That's 4 days a month. These patients got 12 days a month of 40 of dexamethasone. 4 days on, 4 days off, 4 days on, 4 days off, 4 days on, 7 days off, started all over again. Right? That's how I initially treated people with myeloma when I was a myeloma fellow 25 years ago. We would just write them all that dexamethasone. And so Mike at the time said, look, could you do this? And so in conjunction with Dr. Rajkumar, who is now actually the chair of our board, as many of you would know him from Mayo Clinic in Rochester, said, okay, well, let's do this study where we give Revlimid, same dose of Revlimid to both arms, but we'll give high dose Dex in one and low dose Dex in the other. And that's what led to now us giving this low dose dex or 40 milligrams low dose dex, 40 milligrams once a week is still a lot, right? So now we're looking at doing trials with what we're calling lower dose dex, eventually lowest dose dex, but we find that Goldilocks in the middle where we're giving the right amount of dose. So it's an amazing story of not only how drugs get developed, but how the patient voice makes a difference. Because patients were saying, like, this may be working, but look at all the challenge we're having. And by the way, what was interesting in that clinical trial, it wasn't just that the lower dose of dex was as good as the higher dose, it was better. Because more people died from steroid side effects in the high dose dex than in the low dose dex arm. So it taught us that some of these drugs are harsher than we first thought.
So I'm not sure I may be invited to ask Dr. Joe questions in the future because I'm completely off script here, right? So
Shocking that you're off script, right? I don't know if he's ever on script, but okay.
You mentioned ECOG. What is ECOG? And are there other bodies like ECOG within the US? Yeah. So that question number one. And question number two, another board member who's a boss of mine is in the back over there. She's from Canada, a province called Canada of the US.
Okay, now those are fighting words, man, so watch out. I might be moving closer to you now. Yeah.
So do clinical trials also happen outside of the US?
Yeah. So two great questions. I love you, Martin, and I always will, right? I'm a dual citizen now, so it was tough during the Olympics, by the way, because my wife's American, right? So when Emily's in the room, I'm like, yay, go America. As soon as she leaves, go Canada, right? And we did pretty well. Canadians did pretty well this year, yeah. And not just when it involves ice and snow, so it was quite good. So to answer your first question, ECOG, or the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group, so there are several across the country. There's Alliance, there's SWOG, there's transplant groups. The whole idea here is every institution, likes doing clinical trials. They want to provide those options to the patients, right? I've had the privilege of working at Mayo Clinic. Now I'm within the City of Hope Cancer Center system. I've had the privilege of working in different places, and those individual institutions can do a lot, but sometimes you want multiple institutions to come together to do trials because no one institution is big enough to do these big phase 3 trials. And that way is a lot of collaboration. It also provides greater sense of diversity geographically by race and ethnicity, depending on where the sites are located. So there are multiple of these groups. They're often called cooperative groups. They're meant to be sort of collaborative, cooperative groups. And yes, absolutely. If anything, in myeloma, we've seen unbelievable outcomes from clinical trials all around the world. The Canadian Myeloma Research Group that was created by Myeloma Canada, that Martine has the privilege of leading, have actually done some of the most important studies in multiple myeloma. We go overseas, we see that in Europe in particular, we have very strong myeloma research groups in Spain, in Italy, in France, in the UK. And then, of course, the IMF has created, under the leadership of Dr. Dury in the past, now with Weiju Chung, we have an incredible number of clinical trials that are now opening in Asia. We've just created a network in Latin America called the Latin American Myeloma Network. And so there are trials that are done really all over the world. It's not just about God bless Merkel. There's a lot going on elsewhere. And that's really important because we want to make sure that these drugs are not only developed in multiple countries, but they're applicable to different countries. Because we are seeing, as I'll comment tomorrow, even with these new CAR T-cell therapies and bispecifics, there are differences by race and ethnicity and geography in the way these drugs work and in the way they cause side effects.
Thank you. So I will call out Todd Kennedy here. He is also a patient advocate with Alliance, I believe. And so ask him what it takes to be a member of one of these groups and be able to advocate on behalf of other patients. I have one other question.
Sure.
Before I ask you to summarize, or I guess 2 or 3. So when I went to myeloma treatment, initially I was in Dallas. I moved to Arkansas, and I got my CAR-T in a semi-clinical trial setting called expanded access here at City of Hope. We also have a patient here from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, Kent Oliver in the back, and he may not have access to clinical trials in his area, so he may have to go to other places, Mayo or other places. So if a clinical trial A is initiated at City of Hope and someone else is participating at that same clinical trial at Mayo or other places, are the clinical trial design, how I get treated, how I get tested, how I get the drugs, is it the same, or it depends on who my doctor is?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So two ways to answer that. So answer number one is, if it's the same clinical trial, we set very careful parameters around how patients are treated, because we don't want them treated differently because they're at one site versus another. So if Mayo and City of Hope are sharing a clinical trial, those patients have to be treated the same way. That being said, we also, and COVID, if one of the tiny silver linings of the hideousness of COVID taught us, was that even from a regulatory standpoint, we need to build in more flexibility. You know, it used to be that for clinical trials, your blood work had to be done on this exact day at this exact lab, and we started to build a bit more flexibility into the system, especially when it comes to geography, because if someone lives in a more remote area, it may be harder and harder for them to access clinical trials. So we are also trying to be more flexible. There's a whole movement of what we call DCTs, or decentralized clinical trials, where we're trying to say, okay, well, maybe at the big academic centers we need certain trials, but can we do them out in the community? Can we have satellite sites? Because it's not fair that if someone, you know, here, of course, in urban Los Angeles, you have multiple places, even in myeloma, to go for clinical trials. But if someone lives, you know, considerably up the coast and they're far from Los Angeles, can they still get opportunity to be on trials? And so we're trying as much as possible to be able to have that flexibility. So it shouldn't just depend on, if you will, who your doctor is. It's partly the design of the trial. And this is some of the, I know we'll come to it later, the pragmatic things when you talk to your doctor about whether they provide the trial or they can send you to a site like here in Los Angeles. As I mentioned, there's Cedars. We're gonna have Dr. Vesio join us tomorrow. We've got City of Hope, as we've mentioned. There's USC, there's UCLA. I mean, there's so many different choices here. Whether you're with your own doctor or at one of these sites, to ask very pragmatically, how many times am I going to have to come in? Do I need any other additional testing that I wouldn't normally have? What are the financial implications? I know we'll talk more about that in a minute too, but usually we try to ensure that there isn't a financial burden to patients, because if you're going to receive standard of care treatment, that should all be covered in the normal way.
So when patients normally think about clinical trial, they expect some sort of intervention. But are there also observational clinical trial, and is there a great example of an observational clinical trial that you can think of?
Correct. So yes, you're right. When you think clinical trial, you think I'm getting a drug, or I'm getting an intervention, or a vaccination, or whatever it might be. But we have lots of ways of collecting information. You still have to give consent, because it's your blood, your results, whatever it may be. A lot of times we have non-interventional trials that are people just enrolling to have information collected. Or next time we do your bone marrow test, can we take a small sample and take it into our lab to do this and this study on it? That's really important to us, because without that, we wouldn't understand, you know, how different myeloma is in people. One of the ones that I can think of, Yelek, as being a great example of a non-interventional, if you will, clinical trial is what the IMF is doing in the immune therapy registry. So you're going to be hearing about CAR T-cell therapy, bispecific antibodies, that other drug I mentioned, belantamab. These are all new drugs that we're learning a lot about them. I mean, even if you're in a center that treats as many patients as anyone else, there's still a lot to learn from each other. So if only we could pool that information and data to understand it. You know, we, for example, sadly see that there's a small fraction, but an important fraction of patients that have some very unusual side effects from some of these drugs. Some of them are, for example, neurological side effects. So if I treat 100 patients with CAR T-cell therapy this year in my program, I may only see one patient that has this unusual side effect. But if I pool the information with 40 other myeloma sites, now all of a sudden we've got 40 of these, and we can understand it all the more. And so the IMF has created what we call this immune therapy registry, where de-identified information from each of these sites can be pooled together, and then we have this big database that we can interrogate. And we can ask questions that no one would be able to ask, right? Again, I don't want to sound like I'm being a commercial for the IMF, but that's the superpower of the IMF, right? Is bringing people together in a way that otherwise that information would not be accessible. That we're like the Olympics, convening people together so they can perform at their top level, right? That's why so many records are always broken at the Olympics, because there's something about being in that environment, being with others. We want to create that kind of concept. So there may be situations where your doctor will speak to you about a clinical trial, as it were, or a study, they may call it that, where they're not expecting you to receive a drug, but you may just be, your information is being collected to put into a registry, or you may fill out a survey every month as to what your quality of life is like being on a certain drug or not being on a certain drug.
So why don't you quickly touch on what a phase 4 clinical trial is, and I'll ask you to summarize the benefit of participating.
Right, so a phase 4 trial is actually beyond, as you would expect it, beyond the phase 3 trials. So phase 4 is when we're collecting now information in, if you will, the real world setting, as we start to see what happens when it goes out into the real world. And it is actually amazing how many times we have learned things that we wouldn't have seen in those individual trials. You know, some of these myeloma phase 3 trials have 200, 300, 400 patients in them. Even then, that may not be enough patients to fully understand some signals. So in summary, phase 1 clinical trials is small number of patients, finding the right dose to make sure that we know the drug is safe. Phase 2 is based on that dose, giving it to more patients to see how effective it is. Phase 3 is comparing it to the standard of care to see if it exceeds it. And phase 4 is analyzing and evaluating the intervention once it's already made itself into the public.
And quickly, benefits and risks.
All right, so why would you do a clinical trial? Well, the greatest benefit is that you might have access to a drug that you otherwise wouldn't, that can control your myeloma and give you longer and better life. That's always the objective. Very often, as I described earlier, it's that the trial is being done before the drug is formally approved, so you may have access to that drug or that combination earlier on. As you can see here, that you're still at least receiving the standard of care, in that you're not saying, okay, well, I'm just really spinning the roulette wheel, I have no idea how it's going to land. You're still going to receive the standard of care. And then, of course, you are contributing to the greater knowledge. It's not that there isn't that benefit. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't necessarily viewing that as the top benefit. On the risk side of things, of course, there are things we still don't fully understand with these drugs, so there are potential side effects. Usually by the time we're giving this to humans, we have a pretty good sense of what side effects we might expect, and so we can discuss that with you. And this all comes down to how important the communication skills, how important the communication is between you and your healthcare team. If there's anything we've proved in oncology, and I teach this to the medical students and the residents all the time, is that having a therapeutic relationship with your healthcare team, much like Teresa was describing when she described shared decision-making, that has an impact on your survival. So it's one thing to have the fancy schmancy drugs. It's another thing to have a good relationship with your healthcare team. If you don't have a good relationship with your healthcare team, you may want to reevaluate that, because it isn't just a convenience. It actually affects your outcomes. You're more willing to share how you really feel about things, what your signs and symptoms are. They're more reactive to it. There's lots of benefits of having that kind of connection. So there are risks, of course, of that. From a financial standpoint, it's never perfect, and there's always discussion. Sometimes people see this as a benefit, because if they get access to newer drug, then if it's a non-FDA approved drug, ethically you cannot be charged for it. So the drug is provided free. We are trying to ensure that the process of even receiving that drug or traveling to the clinic, for example, for transportation costs and so on, this is a big issue of disparities in trials that I'll mention tomorrow, that in most situations we try to find a way to have that covered as well. But there can be some insurance plans that will have difficulty with certain clinical trials, so that has to be evaluated and looked a little bit more carefully.
So I'm an introvert, and during the break, I was and a geek, sitting on the corner and went to clinicaltrial.gov and found out that there are 445 open and recruiting clinical trials that are available. But statistics also shows us, Dr. Joe, that only about 10% of these clinical trials will successfully complete. And so I guess the question here is, why so little patients participate in clinical trials?
Yeah, it's a great challenge. And part of it is, there are lots of, companies making these drugs, and people want to have the opportunity to see if their intervention works. And so we just expect that not everybody is going to be successful. But a lot of the things you see on this list have clearly contributed to it. That's one of the reasons why we've spent half an hour doing this with you today, hopefully to demystify it a little bit, to help people understand it, because I think people may not be aware. They don't think of it. They think, oh, I'm only going to think of a clinical trial when I've gone through every other approved therapy. There's a lot of mistrust within the system. The history of research is terrible. I give a lecture to our fellows about the history of research. It's terrible. Within the Black community, within the Latino American community, within the white community. I mean, you just go back and look and see what we've historically sadly done, and that's why we have so many rules and protections now. So we have a lot of trust to rebuild. Sometimes patients they feel like, oh, well, if I go to one of these other larger centers, I'm cheating on my doctor, but I tell you, I've been doing this for years. That's why I often call it an expert opinion, not a second opinion, because second opinion makes it sound like the first opinion was wrong. And I have to tell you that the physicians are very supportive when their own patients get an expert opinion from someone who's truly an expert in the field, because then we work collaboratively together. My phone rings at least 2 or 3 times a day from a community oncologist, twice already today, to a community oncologist asking questions about myeloma. And so building that relationship is important. So having, as Teresa showed on her slide, your community oncologist, but having access and connection to a myeloma specialist, I think is really important. And then we have a responsibility as a medical community to make sure we offer them, that we don't prejudge you and look at you and say, oh, well, they're probably not going to be interested in a trial. We are very bad at estimating that. That's historically been one of the reasons why we've seen underrepresentation in trials from African Americans in particular. 20% of myeloma patients in this country are of African descent. Most clinical trials have less than 5% representation of African Americans. And so a lot of it has to do with the way we've couched it and presented it to our patients as well.
I think you're trying to preempt my question. I'm Black, originally from Ethiopia. There are a lot of patients that are Hispanic, member of the LGBTQ community. So they should not participate in clinical trial, right? Because they will be experimented on.
So the answer, of course, is no. That we want to be as inclusive as possible. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I'm just going to assume that all of you have read it, because I'm sure that you all read the weekly blog that comes out from the IMF. Dr. Dury had a weekly blog for so many years, and people were so benefited from it. It was marvelous. I always used to enjoy reading Dr. Dury's, and now every week we have a different person doing it. He's irreplaceable in that way. And so, but I wrote last week's blog, or I guess 2 weeks ago now, blog on diversity in clinical trials. So you all read it, right? Remember, this means yes. So just pretend, just humor me, just nod and say, oh yes, it was riveting, Dr. Joe. But in that, I identified a group of us that gathered, called the Maui Declaration. We were declaring our commitment to diversity in clinical trials by really being thoughtful of the barriers that have historically led to underrepresentation. Everything from geographical and barriers to the things that I discussed earlier of trust and ensuring that we have greater community engagement and so on. So the whole idea is that everybody should be included in clinical trials. There are some things that may exclude you from a clinical trial that you don't have control over. There are things that we're trying to reduce those numbers. There's some things that may. If you had colon cancer last year along with myeloma, some clinical trials will say it's hard to know if one thing is influencing the other. I'm just being very open and blunt with you. There's some things that can exclude people from trials. But some of the things that we've historically excluded people from trials we're trying to reduce, like white blood cell count, right? So many of us from Mediterranean or African descent have a lower white blood cell count. And it was just always assumed that that low white blood cell count means that you're going to be at high risk of infection. So clinical trials say, well, unless your neutrophil count is over a certain number, there's no way you can go on this trial. Well, we've actually come to now understand the genetic basis of that, something called the Duffy null status, some of you may or may not be familiar with. And we've learned that people who have that status, who have a lower white count, actually have just as good a response to infection as anyone else, even though their white count is lower. So now we're trying to go back to our clinical trial exclusion criteria and remove that clause that says if your white count is less than 1, you can't go onto this trial. Those are the kinds of things that we want to do, Yelik, to make sure that we're inclusive, that the language is inclusive, that even the booklets reflect the people that are going to be treated.
You mentioned the importance of having a diverse population participate in clinical trials. Can you say why?
Why? For lots of reasons. One, it's not just because we all want to feel good that everybody's included per se, is that I want to make sure that I know this drug or this trial, this intervention is applicable to my patient. So I commented briefly earlier, we've noticed, for example, with some of these newer therapies like CAR T-cell therapy, we see some differences in race and ethnicities. The risk of getting cytokine release syndrome, that we'll describe a little bit more tomorrow, this reaction that people can get when they get their CAR Ts, is actually different by race and ethnicity. We see higher rates of CRS in patients, in Hispanic patients when compared to white patients, for example. And so if the whole concept of clinical trial is to prove if a drug is safe and is effective, I want to make sure I know it's safe and effective to my patient in clinic. And my patient has the right to say, you know, I'm Black, and this study was done and 99% of people were white. How do we know that this drug can apply to me? So the inclusivity is for the immediate patient to feel to be included, but also to make sure that the purpose of the study, which is to be applied to all myeloma patients, can be done.
While Dr. Joy is finishing, Teresa, Wendy, Robin, you guys can warm up to come up here. Clinical trials are not easy, right? Both for designing, running them, participating. There's a lot of logistics and a lot of uncertainty that is involved in there. What are some of the questions patients should ask their doctors as they consider participating in a clinical trial?
Yes, and some of these are listed here, and we have resources on the website to help, but the point I really want to emphasize here is you'll hear about the informed consent, you know, the sort of legal form that you end up having to fill, and these consent forms are getting ridiculous now. Just they're like War and Peace novels. It's a bit ridiculous. No one is going to read the whole thing. But what's critical is that open, honest communication. Why would I go onto this trial? What am I going to expect with this trial? What are the side effects that I need to be watching for? What implications is this going to have for me for time? Maybe it's just a pill, but it might involve you going in every day for the first month, or it may involve you only going in once a month. So understanding the logistics of it, doing a quick insurance review to make sure that the burden of insurance is not affected, that it doesn't affect you financially. These are the kinds of things you should be able to ask anything. If there's ever a time to make sure that you're not feeling rushed in the clinic, it's when you're having the Q&A around a clinical trial.
Prepare your questions, but I think I want to close with this, which is, where should you go to find a clinical trial that you are eligible for and that you should consider participating? One of the things that we are doing, I mentioned this at the beginning, and I'll mention this again tomorrow, is we are fearlessly collaborating with other organizations who can help advance the mission and the vision of the International Myeloma Foundation. One of the things that we are doing is powered by Spark Cure's clinical trial finding engine. We are embedding clinical trial finder within myeloma.org, and this will be launched on September 12th, the day our support group leaders summit is kicked off in San Antonio. So I wanted to mention that one to tell you that we are bringing clinical trial finder on myeloma.org. Two, that we are fearlessly collaborating with others who want to collaborate with us to advance the mission of the International Myeloma Foundation. And three, I wanted to give time to the panel to come and participate in the Q&A sessions that Dr. Joe. So thank you, Dr. Joe.